Hello and welcome to Education in Focus, powered by Chalkboard News. I'm Dan McCaleb, Vice President of News and Content at the Franklin News Foundation, publisher of chalkboardnews.com. Chalkboard is a news website dedicated to issues related to K-12 education, and joining me again today, as he does each and every week, is Chalkboard's K-12 editor, Brendan Clary. How are you, Brendan?
I'm doing well, Dan. Trying to stay warm here. It's balmy 10 degrees where I'm at. So
10. That's a heat wave where I'm at. Brendan, you're in the Detroit area of Michigan. I am in the northwest Chicago suburbs. We haven't seen temperatures above zero for 3 days.
Whew, Windy City, right?
Yeah, that's right. It is cold, to say the least. I think tomorrow, we're recording this on a Tuesday, January 16th. I think tomorrow we're supposed to see positive digits. It's supposed to get all the way up to 2.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, you got me beat there, Dan.
Anyway, let's get into it, Brendan. You wrote an interesting, although concerning, story at Chalkboard News in recent days about a teacher from the Bronx in New York City who was found to have acted inappropriately with a student, was fired, but then showed up and was rehired by a charter school in New York City, and there was no communication between the two schools. Tell us more.
Yeah, Dan. And if what I found was correct, like on Google Maps, trying to figure out the school that she moved to was about a mile away from the school that she was fired from.
So it's practically the same neighborhood.
Practically the same neighborhood in the Bronx. Yeah. So basically, the Special Commissioner of Investigation for the New York City School District, which is a big name, it's basically the watchdog agency for the New York City School District, public schools, and they published a report on its website in December that was actually dated March 16th of 2023, that a teacher named Raylissa Rivera had sent an inappropriate text to a student and said, I have these feelings for you. And basically kind of outlined how this teacher got closer to a student and then started communicating with her and then had sent this inappropriate text. And so that was sort of all lined out in the report, which was to the chancellor of the New York City Public Schools, David Banks. So that was, the interagency communication to the head of the New York City Public Schools that, hey, this teacher has admitted to these inappropriate texts, and this is what we recommend, including termination. And so the New York City School District said that it did terminate the teacher. And so I was just interested of where is she now, like what's going on. And somebody by the same name was working at a charter school in the Bronx, which is very, very close proximity in the same kind of field too, in the special education. So I just reached out to some of the administrators at the charter school and just said, hey, I just wanted to ask you about this. Is she the same teacher who formerly worked at this other school in the Bronx where she was fired from? And they said, this is the first we're hearing about this. We've done our due diligence. And, essentially, we're going to suspend her and investigate and look into this. And they did confirm that she did formerly work at this Intech high school, middle school in the Bronx. And that's where she was fired from based on what the New York City Public Schools told me. So what I think it points to, Dan, is a, sort of this communication gap between the public school district and some of these charter schools that operate in the same area, but they don't share any of this sort of personnel system, right? So like they don't have the same kind of system. So it's sort of like apples to oranges in terms of, how they communicate with each other.
Quick question on that front, Brendan, because each state is different. Each jurisdiction is a little bit different. Are charter schools in New York City, are they still part of the district, even though they're operated independent of the district?
Yeah, I think they receive funds like that, but they're not sort of overseen the same way as like a district school would be. So I think that they have to comply with, for example, certain laws in terms of transparency, and they get the funding. And so that's part of like the educational matrix in New York City. And that's something that the district can point to, or like the Department of Education can point to and say that there are these schools, these are the education options there, but they don't have that oversight. And so when I first reached out to the press office there, they basically said, we don't comment on charter schools. And so they kind of drew this very hard line in the sand of like, this is outside of our jurisdiction. We don't really have any oversight there. So I think that makes it sort of complicated in that, these are public charter schools and that the public can attend them and that there's, they don't have to pay tuition because it's not like a private school. But at the same time, it doesn't have the same kind of communication with the district that, say, a public charter school would. So that's the hard part about it, I think, is that it is sort of that apples to oranges sort of comparison almost between those schools, right?
So what makes it a little bit more concerning is the charter school that hired this teacher who was dismissed from her former school job, and she's a special education teacher, as I understand it. They did what, according to their guidelines, they did the proper background checks and the fingerprinting and whatnot, but it didn't turn up anything. So it's a complete lack of communication, or whatever you want to say. You found this out about one instance. I mean, what are the chances something like this has happened before?
I know that's what I think is sort of the bigger question. I think it's also, as big as that question is of like, what kind of information gap persists here, right? Like what are we missing? I think as big as that question is, sort of the hard part is how do we quantify that? I mean, how many teachers do not get investigated by the Special Commissioner of Investigation? You know what I mean? How many are not subject to the watchdog agency, who's publishing that report? And, if nobody asked the question too of like, is this the same teacher that was mentioned in the report? What would have happened? So I think that is sort of the broader question is how much of a gap persists and how do we figure? And I know that Chicago Public Schools has had this issue as well, right? They've had, if you designate an employee as do not hire because of, something that was flagged by the Office of Inspector General, for example, is it a personnel issue? And then can they turn around and go to a charter school? So like that communication, like how do we have sort of that, how can you flag personnel and sort of have these different systems to raise concerns while having, sort of these separate entities operating, outside of, the public school district. So I think that is the broader question is how do we, flag teachers for this kind of conduct without, crossing into lines. And I think that, maybe for some people, that's the appeal of the charter school is to have that without the oversight of the public school district. So I think that, that's sort of the line to walk here, Dan.
Brendan, we're almost out of time. So just very briefly, I know when you reached out to the charter school, they said they were unaware of this teacher's issues or past problems, that she was fired, but they said that they were going to suspend her immediately while they looked into it. Probably the proper steps, right? But the next question is, are they doing anything about that information gap that you said?
I'm not sure that the charter school has, the kind of the capacity to do that. And I haven't seen any willingness from the New York City Public Schools to sort of take corrective steps in making that right. So as far as I know, I think that is going to maybe be, a broader question of how do we fix that?
Good reporting there, Brendan. I think that's a gap. If I were in charge of a school district, I want to look at closing
Absolutely.
That gap. Probably worth maybe a follow-up a few months from now saying, hey, did anything happen here? Or could this thing happen again? Brendan, that's all the time we have. Listeners can keep up with this story and all stories related to K-12 education at chalkboardnews.com. For Brendan Clary, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe. Thank you for listening.
Enjoying our podcast? Your reviews help other listeners find our show. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you listen.